So today here on Now and Zen, we have Eric Ederer, and he is a Makam expert and music theorist.
I think that's about right. I think the degree actually says ethnomusicology on it, but de facto, the people that I wanted to hang out with were sort of theory-oriented. So actually, that's an interesting question, because if having then taken my research for doctoral research that I did in Istanbul, Turkey, and turned it into a music theory book, for everyone. There's really nothing else in the English language that kind of covers all the bases. I guess if in the long run, if it's accepted in Turkey, then I'm an ethnomusicologist recording what they gave me. And if they say, no, we don't agree, then I'm a music theorist. It's kind of up to them. But yes, I would say music theory sort of works.
What kind of a guitar do you have back there? I see an unevenly fretted one.
Yeah, I did. I didn't know what we would want to get into, so I kind of put stuff around me here. So what happened was I wanted to make an instrument, an acoustic instrument, with frets that could be used for Makam music, Middle East, Near Eastern music, including Persian music. And so I designed this in Photoshop. I had studied with a guitar maker, a luthier, in the late 80s. But, this was like, I don't know, 2013 maybe? I don't remember exactly. And I didn't have a shop. I didn't have any money. Grad school had taken care of that for me. So I had made a Kickstarter project, just designed it in Photoshop and sent the blueprints to a fellow in Eugene. He's since moved, Josh Humphrey. And he made it for me, and it's just exactly the way I said it, except for he kind of had to design a tailpiece of his own making, and he put, I don't know if you can see, but there's fan bracing on the inside.
I'm not sure what that is, so maybe I'm seeing it, but I am seeing things inside the hole.
It's like crisscross bracing. Instead of just 1, 2, 3 like a normal guitar would, and maybe a fan, it's just like a tic-tac-toe board. And because there's no hole in the soundboard, I'm getting the hole. So the idea was like, on the body aspect of it to have something that would just resonate like a drum. Like you wouldn't want to put a hole in a drum. Don't tell tabla players. I guess they do. They have this thick pad on it or whatever. So then the frets are supposed to be designed, I have designed them. I knew what ratios I wanted, having studied the music for a long time, and had Josh make me this instrument, and it's just terrific. I love it. I'm not sure I tuned it, but yeah, it's pretty. It's basically it. I didn't tune it.
That's a beautiful instrument. So it's a 5-string, and it's got
5 courses.
Yeah, like a 5 double string. For those of our listeners who are listening and not seeing, if you want to go on the YouTube channel, you can look at the video and see this wonderful instrument being played. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about the fret placement. I've talked to Tolga Hancholu a little bit about this, not necessarily the specific fret sizes, but whether it's customary to add frets to instruments that play makam music, or if that's sort of a modern invention to get the accuracy of the microtones. Like, how common is it?
No, actually, the earliest the earliest depictions of an instrument that will become the oud, and the earliest writings about the instrument that is called the oud describe where the frets go. So the oud actually loses its frets in a certain period, probably in the 7th century Iraq somewhere. That's what I've heard anyway. And then it gets them back later. So it travels across North Africa into Andalusian Spain, and then eventually that becomes the lute. So al-oud is the same word as a lute. It's the same thing, like in Spanish, norange, and in English, orange, una naranja. There's this elision here. So al-oud becomes a lute, and they put the frets back on. But then there's a kind of, so this instrument is sort of, actually I was going to say that the five-coursedness of this is, it's either new or it's ancient. Hasn't been traditional recently. But then I had my main luthier in Istanbul make me a 5-course version of this. Now, I have a 4-course version, but it's in another room. But this is the Lavta, L-A-V-T-A, and it was, again, invented or designed. You can see the tied-on frets. Yes. Now, that's the way that they would have been done when the Arabs found them, when they, in 750, they basically moved shop from Damascus. They moved the caliphate to Baghdad, or started Baghdad as a big city, and sort of took over the seat of what had been, the seat of empire for, thousands of years at that point. And they found instruments like this and started writing about them and writing about the science of music. They didn't think of music as being ethnic, like we would say Arab music or Turkish music or Armenian music or whatever. They just thought of it as the science of music. And so the frets were tied on in accord with that. And then so these were 4-course. Now this is 5-course. So this is sort of backwards engineered from the other instruments called the nautilauta, partly because it's in the shape of a nautilus, and partly just for the pun. It's not a lauta. So this is a lauta. This one's not.
That's excellent.
It sort of works out, except that I have to say that every time I say, what's the name of that thing? And then 20 minutes later, I get to go to the next subject. But it's cute, all right. In any case, these instruments started out sort of with 4 courses, and then someone added 5th. There's different people who are attributed to, they said, Ziryab in the 9th century added the 5th string or whatever. It's not really known. But in any case, the frets, I guess, are indigenous to the tradition. It's just that the oud, so this one's an oud. This is sort of, these are both cousins descended from a common grandfather, really. So you can't say that either one is the first exactly, but probably the grandfather looked a little bit more like the lauta than it does the oud. And in fact, the word lauta is just another word. It's the same. It's a variation of the word al-oud. So, because it went across, it went across North Africa, hung out in Spain and Portugal, up into, the troubadour business up in southern France, all the way across, goes into Italy, and then some Venetian and Genoese traders, I think, show up with something like this, calling it, the name just keeps changing a little bit, and they showed up on Crete. I think the Venetians held Crete for quite a while. Yeah, and basically this becomes, there's a Cretan lauto, and then this is a version of it then that Greeks brought from Crete to Istanbul. And so once they bring this back down to Baghdad, I think it's a full circle, really. But it's just kind of made this whole world tour, and the names just change a little bit, and so many strings and so many frets, and it's a pretty fascinating story, but you can definitely see how they're all cousins,
And I guess I assume that it traveled so far because of its usefulness as an instrument, or what kind of slightly new sound it offered compared to the other stringed instruments that were there. Is that sort of why they travel so quickly, or are there other reasons?
It's very user friendly. You can make them. I mean, everywhere where you can get wood, you can make them. And there are versions with skin faces for when you've got more goats than wood.
Yeah.
And they're very. Actually, there are times and places where when plucked strings, lute family instruments were sort of considered, like taboo or associated with low life or prostitution or too much drinking or whatever. This is definitely the case. But usually those places would have had musical traditions that were maybe the harp or the lyre or some other set of instruments would be the upper class instruments, and then these ones would be the lower class ones. But they're very user friendly. All of Makam theory, that we might say, all of the theorists were oud players, whether or not in the early days, in the, say, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, maybe during those centuries, they presumed that whatever was called an oud in theory texts would have had frets, or at least they were positioning where you would put your finger where there would be a fret if you would have them. The modern oud does not have any frets, and so the theory actually is surprisingly oud shaped, because it was the theorist's instrument. It was like the piano became for music education in whatever it is, 300 years ago, let's say.
Yeah.
So everybody kind of, you could say that there are presumptions in the thinking about the music, no matter what your instrument is, that presume that you're going to have a bunch of open strings and fourths from each other, and that or fifths. Like this one has three. There's fifths in the bottom, and then fourths in the top. So it's always going to be kind of fourthsies or fifthsies. You're gonna, whereas the modern guitar, for instance, the standard guitar, in order to get the two octaves on the outsides, with otherwise all fourths, has to have this major third in the middle there. But it's always out of tune. Actually, well, they're always out of tune anyway. I guess that's why we're Zen harmonic here. We don't have to explain all of that, I suppose. But we don't have that annoying third if it's all fourths and fifths. But structurally, the thinking is built around the way an oudist would play and think about things. In fact, the word makam means place, and the first time it was used in musical literature was in the year 1300 by Qutb al-Din al-Shirazi, I believe, and the language in which he was writing actually was Persian, but he used this Arabic word, makam. It's also Aramaic and Hebrew, the same word. Makam means place, and so by that meaning, your finger position on an oud. Like that's what makam meant. Like the modern dastgah in Persian music, it literally means hand position. So makams are like, what an oudist literally does with his or her fingers. So in that sense, it's the whole concept of makam and the theory around it, whether you're just singing or that you're an instrumentalist of any kind, is kind of shaped by oudness.
Right. What are some other examples in maybe the theoretical literature or in musical tradition where you see the influence of the oud sort of being the main instrument that everybody has to know culturally to understand how things work?
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, it pretty much shows up in miniature paintings and in the just sort of like, I mean, if you were learning music theory, your teacher would be handing you the oud and saying, "Let's do this." Like it's just sort of implicit in the literature. I guess I didn't realize it myself that it was that prevalent or that baked into it. I wouldn't have even noticed actually, except that I have a teacher who himself had been an oudist, but for the last more than 20 years was really a ney player. And so he was kind of telling me, he's my hojam, my guru in ethnomusicology, Scott Marcus here, who's an ethnomusicologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. That's where I'm in Santa Barbara, California. And I got my degrees, the trifecta here at UCSB. And so, he being a ney player sort of noted as something embarrassing for ney players, but that I should know as a ethnomusicologist, that ney players kind of have a distorted version of understanding of how makams work because of the fact that they just pick up another instrument. I mean, if they say, for this makam, you just grab that ney, they come with a little case of 10 or 11, or depends on the tradition, 7, could be 7. And if it hadn't been for that, and then being aware and noticing, oh, the qanun players do this, and the each of the instruments have a sort of different way of constructing it, that it only and being very, very involved with the theory per se, as theory, or as a sort of that's when I kind of figured that out. I don't think it's obvious until it gets pointed out.
Theory in olden times used to be more associated with performance. It's almost like you don't see theory and performance really divorced of each other until sort of a more modern era, I guess maybe the 20th century.
I think there's always been a dialogue because, we have this saying, it's that it's the victors that write the history. But really, it's the literate who write the history. There are people who write about having lost, but the fact is that the theorists are the ones who are writing about it. So we do have some people who have always been like performance oriented, who disagree with theorists and saying, that's not real. Even Aristophanes was complaining about Pythagoras, saying, nobody's playing those. Nobody's playing those. It should be done by ear, or have these other ones available to you. And I think I think music theory is one of those things that has multiple utilities. Like at the very esoteric, at the highest, if you want to say it that way, level, it's a literary genre of other theorists writing each other love letters about their ideas about something. and that thing it's never real. It's like if you were a botanist, you could really say something definitive about green onions. But here we're describing a thing that can be described accurately in multiple different ways. And so if you're not yourself a theorist, then it's kind of important if you're going to be teaching, and particularly if you're teaching teachers. And at the next level, it's kind of important for musicians who want to play with other musicians and be able to just call something out and say, "Oh, what are you doing?" and explaining to each other. But it kind of it fades. There's a crossfade of its utility where there's a lot of people who play just by copying what they've heard and calling that by the names that the theorists come up with. And I mean, you can't say that anything along that spectrum is really incorrect. It's just what people are doing and how they're describing it. So music theory is, it's on a spectrum, I guess. The ideal would be that the theory actually describes it. So there's a genre called taksim, if we're writing it as though it were Arabic, we would say Taqsim, and in Turkish it's Tqsim. And we could say that it's like improvisation, but I think it's important to make a differentiation. So when John Coltrane or Miles Davis or somebody is improvising, say they're going to improvise, they're going to call it blues in B flat. Well, they have 7 notes that they can play with, and they can do anything they want with them. And in fact, they're going to play the other 5 notes. They're going to deconstruct B flatness. They're going to sound like a duck. They're going to modulate. They're going to do all kinds of different things in order to show what's interesting to do with B flat. But makam music is kind of different from that, because what it is it's a musical genre that we know it was invented in the mid 17th century, so 1600s, in the Ottoman court in Istanbul. And the point of it is to apply your knowledge of the generative grammar, the poetic grammar of the music you're playing. So you have to know that, and then you're applying it in the moment of, composition / performance. So you kind of always have to be in a makam. You always have to be evoking some makam in order to stay within the poetry of it. And sort of unlike, Western arts of all kinds, including classical music, they haven't gone through a phase where, they're not postmodern yet, and don't need to be. There used to be a square, a box, and into that thing, it was art, and into that thing you could put one thing, and it was beauty. And then some jokers came along and said, well, what if we put a urinal in there? What if we put ugly in the beauty box? What happens if we do this and that? And then Western music is often running in sort of all sorts of interesting ways, including John Coltrane solos, which we love, and that's the norm now. But makam music is still very conservative in the sense that it presumes it's about beauty. The music theory isn't just it's a grammar. It's like in the same way that we speak with, like we understand what we are using grammar without having to without describing it. There's some people who want to be able to describe it. This is the indirect object pronoun. It's like, oh, that's terrific that you know that. But everybody is speaking anyway. They're using these things whether or not. And if they change, things change. Is there such a thing as whom anymore? I don't know. I saw it day drinking under a bridge. I think whom's going away.
Maybe.
But I like it. I still use it. But it's like the praxis. The praxis just means application of theory. So in that sense, it's not a taksim isn't an improvisation. It's an expression. It's an application of the performer / composer's knowledge, it's their expression in this poetic grammar. And so in that sense, it's kind of, I think of it as the beating heart of the art form, which is unusual in a sense because I think most people think of repertoire as recorded repertoire that's gone over and over again as sort of more important. And that's sort of the normative view from a conservative point of view to say, hey, how do you learn to make a taksim? Well, you and your teacher just go over a dozen pieces in such and such a makam, and then the two of you together notice the things that happen over and over again within this, within this repertoire, and then you kind of repeat that, and your teacher approves of it, and 15 years later, magically you can do, like literally they speak of it this way. Yeah, 10 years later, you can just make a taksim. But you don't have to do it that. I mean, the problem with that is that it repertoire to me is just like it's something beautiful that's left behind. Like there's no piece of repertoire and no set of pieces of repertoire in the same makam or melodic mode that can exhaust the possibilities. So if you're only copying what was before, if you're limiting your own expression to what has gone before, I don't know, I kind of liken it to kind of a bunch of people who are really carefully curating an art gallery full of paintings of flowers, but they've let the garden outside die. It's like, well, how do you think the painters who painted these paintings learned to paint flowers? They were out in the garden. So I think that is the kind of place where the dialogue between what is theory useful for, how are you using theory, and how it affects practice, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road there is in a practice like taksim, which you can then deconstruct and say, oh, now I'm improvising. Now I can sound like a duck. Now I can throw in jazz and blues. But when I'm in makam, I'm going to be in real makam or whatever.
So then what would your sort of analogous term be for, well, improvisation? Really a more constrained version that you're talking about. That is also like dealing with, music literacy of makam at a very high level, since it has to sort of know the tropes of makam. Like, is there a word for that you would use instead of improvisation?
No, again, it's like I'm in the position where we kind of have to describe it like that. I don't think. I think that originally, the word improvisation probably did mean that. I mean, for Mozart, it probably did. It was just implicit. For Bach, these guys, it was just implicit that you would have to know the hell out of theory in order to do what they called improvisation. But nowadays, I think because of I keep using the word post-modernity, but I'm meaning taking apart that which was traditional in order to show it in a new light and to use new techniques in an old way, and vice versa. I think that nowadays what we just think of as improvisation doesn't depend on as big a knowledge about theory. Maybe that's just the way to put it. I mean, heavy jazz people are definitely they're soaking in theory. They can tell you what they did in terms of the chord changes and whatnot, but they're not obliged to be somewhere at a certain time, whereas in makam theory, it's like, no, you should always be in a specific, like, makam, evoking it, or signaling that you're moving to another one, and then modulate to that other one, and then be in that one for a while. Whereas, jazz or any other improvisation generally kind of just moves at the speed of the person's creativity, regardless of rules. And I mean, that's what makes it special, is that it's not following rules. It's just a different approach to things.
Yeah. So the ways that makams can modulate to each other or evoke each other is something that you talk about in your book a little bit. What are some melodic tropes or characteristics of certain makams that would tell a listener, hey, we're like, doing Beyati or whatever?
Right. Well, every makam can be described as, in terms of, we could say it this way, a bunch of characteristics. So it's going to be, made up of, I'll say genera, genuses. So the Arabs pronounce it jins, but it's from the old Greek word genos, just meaning, originally it referred to a tetrachord, meaning 4 notes. So like there's 4 notes. So it's either going to be, this is from a Turkish point of view, and depends on, the way I understand it, it depends on tetrachords, 4 notes in a row like that, pentachords, 5 notes in a row like that, and trichords. So basically you have 3 different ways of making. Now, it's not the case that every makam necessarily has a 7-note scale, as we're used to, but most of them have something inside of it that can be described as a central octave. So let's just take, like you mentioned, Beyati, so it would have this, the second degree is not on the piano, right. Minor third, perfect fourth. And then conjoined to it is going to be a pentachord. So you need a tetrachord and a pentachord if you want to get to the upper octave. So in the makam Beyati that we're talking about here, you would expect on top of that to have basically minor pentachord. Okay. And so, if we now let's actually let me use a slightly different one. I'm going to use this on the top here. So it's neutral, but we're going to I think of it as a kind of low major third. And then that 4. So you can have 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're conjoined, meaning the tone in the center, they share. The highest note of the lowest jins is the same as the lowest note of the upper jins. So there are, by way of just kind of giving you ideas of what constitutes a makam, there's 4 makams right off the bat, the simple ones, that share those same notes. 2 of them have this as a tetrachord, and then a pentachord on the top. And so one of them goes from the bottom towards the top. That's called neva. But if you start from the top and you hang out at the top for a long while at the beginning of a melody or performance, and then move your way down, and then that's got a different name. It's a different makam, because one of the things that each makam has is a direction of melodic movement. It either starts around the dominant, or it starts at the top, or it starts at the bottom. So then we have if we say, okay, there's a pentachord at the bottom. Now that's a completely different. That's 2 other makams. And if it starts at the top, it's a different makam. So those are 2 other makams. And that's, so what do makams have a structure that can be described in terms of conjoined jinses. They have a melodic direction, seyir it's called, pathway, and they have idiosyncratic senses of intonation. So, for instance, I learned, like when I learned this one we'll call Husseini, that has the penachord on the bottom. I learned that that second degree can be higher than if you're playing in Beyati. That was
right.
So, and so, for instance, so this is let's use the lower one just to make sure that it's clear. That, and then on top of that that's called, I'm going to use the Turkish word ushak, which basically is like the Arabic Beyati. And then on top of that, conjoined to that, is another one, ushak, in nature, in flavor, I guess. So those are two. That means that the in theory anyway, the second degree and the sixth degree should be perfect fifths from each other. But in fact, you can play them both a little bit higher. But certainly when you're playing where it's Beyati on the bottom, the makam neva, well, that's an ushak tetrachord, Beyati tetrachord if you want to call it. But now we have a rost on top. So now that's the sixth degree has to be higher. It's no longer, it has to be broader than a perfect fifth. Why? Because this is being a rost penachord. Sorry. Rost needs that note to be as it needs. For it, it's a third. 1, 2, 3. For this, it's a second, but it needs it to be the higher one. So they're not always in tandem with each other. It's according to the jinses that each makam has its idiosyncratic intonation issues. And let's see, some makams sort of, if you will, want to modulate to certain places and not to other places. You know, like they'll have characteristic associated modulation places. Yeah, every makam is going to have like these 5 or 6 things. They'll have to fulfill these bits in a paradigm. So when you learn a makam, you go, okay, what's its structure? What if it doesn't repeat at the octave? What's underneath or above it? If it's if it's a compound makams are made out of other whole makams, you could say. So it's like, wow, there's a whole other place to go with those, you know?
Would you say, okay, so you're talking about the jinses, or the genera, I suppose, as being sort of the smallest units of the makam.
Well, I'd say that they're the smallest unit of meaning. So there are intervals, but an interval doesn't mean anything. Like if you are playing in a makam and then a single note changes, well, that's not a single note. What's changed is the jins it's in, and then the way that it's conjoined to whatever didn't change evokes a new makam.
Okay.
So that's that it's the genus that's the first level of meaning. In the same sense, like a word is the first level of meaning. And the alphabets, you got to know the alphabet, but T, P, L doesn't really mean anything. You know what I mean? Once you start making words, you're like, oh, okay, now we got it. Now I guess that word.
Now the fans are going to look up that acronym and be like, it means this.
I'm not sure it does.
Yeah. Do makams generally move stepwise most of the time, and is that how they get their modulations across?
Yeah, that's kind of complex. I wouldn't say, I say melody very often moves stepwise. That's true. And then there's a place for larger than stepwise motion to call out certain makams. So for instance, in the makam earlier, we were talking about Husseini. Here's a lick that's associated with Husseini. So if you hear that lick, you're just going to say, it's the Kiss Me I'm Husseini t-shirt. So it's using little leaps. Or for instance, Rost. Rost is kind of major, but the third and the seventh degree are not on the piano. They're lower. They're microtonally lower. So there's a major sixth kind of a leap that is characteristic. So you use a lot of times, like So you're starting. If this is the dominant, here's the root. So if we have this kind of sol mi re do ti do, and you'll hear in some older repertoire too, you'll hear that major sixth from the root to the sixth. So there are sometimes you'll have a big leap. You won't have very big leaps most of the time in melodic movement, not because any particular makam likes or doesn't like it, but the exception then is, they're often used to call out. They're used to call out a makams, or like a Beyati kind of lick would be. So that gets us to the dominant, the fourth degree. If we were just playing it, but we're starting from the subtonic. Te me, T from the 7 minor third, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 5, 4. So that's a kind of like, it's got weird intervals already, but they're placed together in such a way that they kind of make a little tattoo or a little cheshni, I guess is the right proper word for it. Cheshni just means like a taste of something. Like if I were handing you some cake, hey, taste. Do we want a taste of this? So it's like a taste of a particular makam. So there isn't. This would definitely be a good project, for a grad student or something, to go over and just literally make an anthology, of cheshnis and like make a little. You could look them up, or that would require more research, and that would require more funding.
Yes, it's a lot of work. Yeah. So how did you get started with your dissertation initially? How does that story go?
Good question. I mean, I already had a degree. My bachelor's degree from back in the Iron Age was music composition, Western music composition, and I was just into theory as a language, as a as a thing, as a literary genre, I guess you could say, and definitely as a shaper, helping me shape music as a composer. And I sort of got into Middle Eastern music a little accidentally, or it's just sideways. It's kind of stumbled into it, I guess, and it just happens to be that. So, for instance, in the Arabic-speaking world, people are not into memorizing. The musicians are not talking about makams, or they're not conversant in theory. Whereas in Turkey, it's just expected that every competent musician is able to talk about it in a really articulate and specific and detailed way. And that's not, that's neither here nor there. It's just the way the two groups do it. So I was lucky in that the makam music that I just felt attracted to was the version that, or which one is the chicken and which is the egg, I don't really know. But I was attracted to the one that was able to articulate it in a way that I wanted to receive it, which is music theory. So basically what happens is that I went over there, and then just the question we started with was, what's the difference between theory and practice? And it just happened that, so makam music was, especially we say classical music, was associated with the court, and that is the empire. So once the empire fell over, and the Republic of Turkey was being, well, it's just like everywhere when after World War. Well, I think we'll be lucky when World War I actually ends. But at the armistice, everything just the concept of empire kind of dissolved. So all the empires just fell apart. Russia and Austria-Hungary and Turkey, and there was a regime change in Turkey and Persia that didn't last. And it just kind of, so part of their replacing it with something more modern, more Republican, a republic, was getting rid of classical music at first. So they made it illegal. It was banned from the radios. You weren't supposed to, be into it anymore. They were going to try to replace it with basically West orchestral music, or orchestral music that melded with folk music in the way that Zoltan Kodály and Bartók and these guys were doing. It was a huge movement, this sort of nationalist, ethnic, the folk of the music, lifted up in orchestral music. but there were just enough people who were like, no, we don't want this to go away. It's our music. We like it. So the music theorists had to. There had been historically, but not in a recent century, music theory that people were referring to and using all the time. It was part of an oral tradition. And so in order to legitimize it and make it look Western and make it look scientific and logical and not just a remnant of some backwards Oriental past, as they would have framed it then, they, the theorists had to make the theory and squish it down into something. The pedagogy was, you'd have a teacher. You'd go see that teacher every day for 15 years. They'd teach you to sing. They'd teach you to play if you were playing. They'd introduce you to the people who are going to be making your instruments and where you're going to get gigs. And they were teaching you to be a musician in the world. And, and you were sweeping up and playing backgammon and whatever it was you were doing with them for 15 years. And then you were, they would they'd go on stage with you and you were kind of graduated. Well, but now the pedagogy is, okay, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you study notation with this person, and on Thursdays, you have ear training with this person, and, everything was atomized to meet the Western pedagogy, and they had to make a music theory that would fit that so that you could get a bachelor's degree after 4 years and you're done, because that was what looked like it was modern and right. Well, it turns out that both ends of things got a bit screwed up that way, because the theory is left out a huge amount. It's wrong in many ways. It's wrong in strategically, politically expedient ways that, in a sense, saved it as an academic discipline. And but in a parallel way, there's then the oral tradition that was kind of busted because for the same reasons, I guess. For political reasons, there was just less of it. The teachers couldn't get... anyway, it was made difficult. So anyway, my proposition was to go there and to say, look, let's look at everything. I'd already been learning it in the oral tradition with Necati Çelik. He's an oudist. And I started learning with him in 2002, I guess. And then while here, I was learning Makam with mostly Arab-oriented people, but still Makam. I mean, and then in the summers I would go to Turkey and study over there. And so I was getting. By the time I was doing my PhD research, I was auditing classes at the main conservatory there at Istanbul Technical University. But the reason was to see how they were teaching it, not because I already knew what they were teaching substantively, but I wanted to see how they were teaching it, what text they're using. And so basically, I just had to gather up, I had to read every theory text that there was from the last 200 years and study recordings, the early recordings, actually, this is my job now. Let me just grab one.
Yes. For
those of you listening, but not able to see, it's I've got a 7-inch shellac disc in Ottoman with just a little bit of a bad translation. This is the Odeon record. This is, what is this? Oh, this one happens to be Hungarian, but the rest of them are Turkish Ottoman. But listening to recordings of these guys to get an understanding of what it was, how it was that people were playing takseems, and understanding how the system worked. In other words, I'm using takseems to backwards engineer the theory that they were applying. You know what I mean? From a period before the time that today's music theory was the norm. So I'm comparing that plus the oral tradition that I was already in, and the theory that they were teaching in universities and all of the books. Here's like everybody in Turkey's got this book. It's Türk Müzikisi Nazariyatı ve Usulleri. I'm reading that backwards. And it's Ismail Hakkı Özkan. And everybody knows what the mistakes are because there's mistakes in the book. It's made with the mistakes. And so the idea is you have to learn in both traditions. You have to learn one, and then the others will deconstruct it for you. Your oral tradition teachers will say, oh, here's what's wrong with that. And so instead of it being just this dialogue where everybody's saying, yeah, we know our theory's wrong, and I describe it this way, but that guy describes it some other way, and everybody's got their own way. My idea was just say, look, let's look at the whole thing, and let's adjust the theory. Let's compare it and say, here's what everybody's actually doing, and here's how we would use theory to explain it in a way that's organic to the theory people already know and are using the rhetoric of. So that was sort of the mission. And I think I did an okay job with it. One person had made a slight attempt at theorizing how modulation happens. And it's modulation happened because there was no modulation, just barely any, before the invention of this genre called the tocsin, which is the application. So it was a game, basically, that composers at court, the highest up composers and performers at the time in the 1630s through 1650s who were inventing this. And the game was, hey, without quoting any repertoire that we already know, start in a makam and get it to sound good going through all of the makams you know. And so people just got into this and be like, well, you try to make it last an hour. You're showing off, you'd play and then people would name it, say, oh, you went from blah, blah, blah to blah, blah. And this just opened up it opened up modulation. But so after that, there's a huge change, and there's a new makams. Things that used to be just a lick were turned into a makam. And then there's an explosion of compound makams. So makams made making a relationship between the two, like a little spice mix. And so this happened from the mid 17th century, and nobody ever wrote down, like every theory book is just a description of each makam, but they never tell you, there's no description of how it happens. So because I took tocsin to be the application of theory in the moment of composition, my idea was, look, I took, I think 100 tocsins in live ones, not also listening to old ones, but live ones from people, that I knew. And I said, listen, just make a tocsin, and then we'll watch it again on my computer. And while we're doing it, I'll record you describing what you're doing. And then I'll write that afterwards as subtitles. And that will be the basis for analysis. We'll say, we'll backwards engineer what the real theory is by getting a representative sample of people doing it, applying their knowledge. So that is kind of the novel thing about the research, is that it says, oh, did you notice that? And all this, and it also sort of, the way I'm looking at it, the way they describe it, but they're not allowed to think of it this way. They're not allowed to have the concept of a trichord. The Arabs have such a concept, but for some reason, it's just like, I don't know, it's a weird thing in Turkish. It's idiosyncratic to Turkish music theory. It'd be like if there were a law that said, listen, everybody's name can only have 3 letters in a row. So if your name is Eric, sorry, it's now Ari, and then it's C connected to whatever the next 3 letters of your middle name is. It'd be like, what? Yeah, you're only allowed to have tetrachords and pentachords. Like, well, but here's clearly a trichord. Even, the earlier people are definitely using trichords. Earlier theory does recognize trichords. In any case, so those are basically kind of the novel aspects of my doctoral research.
I see.
Firstly, to look at that whole thing and say, what's the difference between the oral tradition and the theory tradition, and what would you do with it? And then sort of incidentally saying, hey, did you notice that there are principles behind how modulation happens? That was kind of what I did.
Yeah, so you essentially, your dissertation not only gives us valuable information about the praxis in English that hasn't been given, but it also attempts to examine the existing practice and derive theory from it instead of just quoting theory from older times.
Yeah, and there are legitimate arguments against the way I have presented it, definitely. I mean, I disagree with the one major one that's kind of popular today is that it really should be oriented around repertoire and maintaining and reproducing what's in the repertoire. And that's completely legitimate. They're not wrong. The people who learn it that way and who play it that way they do it beautifully, and they're doing something beautiful. Again, it's a matter of the danger. What I see as a danger with that, it's not a danger if you don't care, but it's something that happened in Egypt. It's something that happened in Iraq. It's something that had happened ages ago in Persian music and in like Azeri, Makam, and other Makam traditions, is that it becomes about a repertoire. You're memorizing something that your teacher told you, and then you're just exactly reproducing it. And so then you're stuck in you're only allowed to ornament it differently, or it loses. There's a tendency to lose makams. There's many fewer makams played now, especially in Egypt. Because Egypt at the 100 years ago was part of the Ottoman Empire. When they got their independence, and they had been run by somebody other than Egyptians since Philip of Macedon, I guess, or his son, what's his name? Alexander the Great. Like, that's a pretty long time not to have your own country. So they were so excited about having their own country that they threw a bunch of babies out with a bunch of bathwater. And they extremely simplified their makam theory and praxis. And today, I mean, it was really, really rich in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They had a really burst of real creativity in Egypt, particularly, and throughout the Arabic-speaking world, well, particularly the Eastern Arabic, so Egypt and eastward. But now it's like maybe you have 5, 6, 7 makams are played, where maybe it used to be 150. I think in Turkey, I think by the time you're like an adult, like me, I'm in my 50s. I've been playing for a while. I should probably know maybe 60 to 80 makams pretty well. But they're being forgotten in some parts and I think the reason is because they just are trying to reproduce, they're doing different things to limit it. So one of them is throwing out a bunch of material because it used to be Turkish and you don't like the Turks for a while. And some of it could be, there are many reasons for which, people might oversimplify to such an extent that it kind of closes off the tradition. And I think that an approach towards makam music that I would say fetishizes, not literally, but makes a kind of a fetish of the repertoire, paints itself in a corner where it's not going to have new flowers to paint. It's just going to paint paintings of flowers of paintings of flowers. So it's like, okay, if that's what you want, it's none of my business. We've got Makam in California, and we do it, we do it our way. So,
right. It seems kind of scary that a lot of the tradition could be lost just from people having that attitude, and then you have less and less scales, and slowly everything sort of becomes simplified through that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, but you can't say it's a loss if you feel it as a loss, and if it's not, it's like, well, we just are doing this. And that's okay. And cultures are going to change one way or another, but and they get to choose however they want it.
It kind of reminds me of a lot of the plight of microtonality, or perhaps of language, where we don't want to lose these wonderful treasures of other traditions, but it makes it inconvenient, I guess. Like, if you have lots and lots of languages in the world, there are these beautiful languages that you want to keep in remote areas, but then, there's a language barrier now. So I think there's lots of people who just want to do away with all of that and have a very simple thing for everybody that's always the same. But I don't think that way. I think there should be that kind of cultural diversity, even when it's inconvenient, which I guess fits right in with anything microtonal, of course. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been having to play an instrument that's using makam tuning, and 12th tone equal temperament has been a problem, like playing with a piano, and then you're like, oh, you don't have that note there, so this isn't going to work?
I mean, so the way that makam music has always kind of yeah, I would say always kind of been structured. It always had the 12 tones that we call Pythagorean.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the object that temperaments, 12 tone equal temperament, messes with a little bit. So I always have something that's, all of my instruments have something that's close enough. Like you're not going to notice it at the speed of repertoire. You're not going to notice 2 cents difference.
Right.
Or, you know what I mean? I mean, it's compounded because the idea is that they're based on the circle of fifths, so that, you know, from C to G is only 2 cents different when you're temperate, and then G to D that's another 2 cents. So then you've got 4 cents from C to D.
Right.
And you know what I mean? Like you're losing, you're spreading them out.
Error accumulates.
Yeah, I mean the fact is, it's a funny thing with I mean, there's a kind of you know, we're dealing with culture here. Like I said, it's not onions, it's not biology, but there is a kind of romantic, or, you know, spiritual, if you want to call it, kind of feelings about what does it mean to be in tune. And so, you know, and I think that's I think it's a Venn diagram between the the romantic and the actual, where yeah, I think it probably is true that your brain thinks that 5 against 4 is more resonant than 81 over 64. And you can just kind of like, this is 5 and this is 4.
Yeah.
The fact that my brain can just go, oh, I can do that, but forget about 81 over 64. It's too complex.
Yeah, you have to cheat and pretend that you're doing a simpler one and then adjust it.
Yeah, I think that consonants, I think that our nervous systems do prefer the simpler ratios, or that they do prefer something that's in ratio. So, like, you know, if I'm playing like the difference between that is that this is happening 12, that's pushing 12 waves towards your ear. At the same time, this is pushing 13.
Ooh.
It's not that it sounds better or worse than some other interval, but somehow the simplicity of that is quite nice. And there is something maybe organic. I mean, I think the people who say, oh, it doesn't matter, I prefer 31 tone equal temperament, you know, equal temperaments. Yeah, I mean, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, I think it's like, if you're the kind of person who doesn't really care if you go to a really expensive Chinese restaurant or you go to Panda, it's just like, I just want some Chinese food, then it's not going to really matter. You're just going to get your Chinese food, you're going to dig it, and it's okay. And if you're someone who doesn't really care, I mean, I think it's perfectly good. I was, you know, as a guitarist, I was completely, but when I was a guitarist since I was a little kid, and then I, you know, had my full Western education in music through bachelor's in composition anyway, and it was like, that was just completely normal. I didn't think about it at all, and then I got into just intonation, music that uses just intonation. It tries rhetorically. It's useful to use a language that says, "Oh no, that's 53 tone equal temperament," but it's not. It's just that it's easier to be able to say, "Oh, make that a comma flatter." Well, if you want to use that language, then you're implicitly saying that there's an equal temperament. But aside from the rhetoric, once I got into this music, it was very difficult to listen to a regular piano or a guitar. I couldn't do it. And then, then because you're, as an ethnomusicologist, you don't just have one area. You kind of have to do a general study of world music of the world. I was like, well, you know what? They've got a particular way of doing things in every village in Java, and it sounds weird, and they dig it. And it's just like, oh, Western 12-tone equal temperament is just another weird ethnic tuning in the world.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Once I accepted it as a weird, as that, I'm like, oh, okay, we can do it. I don't prefer to play in it. That's the answer. Is like, once I was playing to an earlier question, once I was playing these, I made the nota lauda that I showed earlier, and then I said, you know what, I just feel like being a guitarist again. So I just bought a cheap Squire's Fender's cheap student model, a body, took the neck off, got a baritone neck made for me up at Warmouth, which is a company in Puyallup, Washington. And then I had a luthier. I told him where I wanted the frets. I said, it's going to be this long. Here are the places. I calculated it out. and a competent luthier put the frets in for me, and now I have an electric guitar. I tune it like an oud. I can play Makam music on this all day. It's got the same frets as my Laute has. I can play all my Makam music and still sound like, my version of the Eagles or Creedence Clearwater Revival or, jazz people or whatever I can pull off.
12-tone equal temperament then is a subset of that fretting on that guitar. Is that right?
Well, no, it's really 3-tone. It's so 3 limit. You know the limit. What I mean by prime limit.
Yes,
right?
I'm very familiar.
Yeah, so that means that when we talk about the ratios, that like 3, if they're all divisible, like 3/2 is a perfect fifth, we call it. It's that interval is just is the simplest, kind of non-octave one.
Right.
And so Pythagoras is a funny guy. He's brilliant. But he's also a wacky cult leader. He's like, don't eat onions, don't eat beans, because if you fart, you'll be losing some of your pneuma. You'll lose some of your spirit. It's like, no, you just go ahead and fart.
I've been farting this whole time.
Right? Your cat knew.
Yeah.
So one of his wacky things was to say that for music, any prime number higher than 3 is not proper for it's impure or something. Like ideologically, he said, we're just going to make tones out of perfect fifths. So that means 3/2 times 3/2. That gives you 9/4, but you want to squish them into an octave, so you multiply it by half, and you get a 9/8. That's the major second. And you just keep doing that all the way around. Well, so the tones that I have on here, we have 12. Like theory, the thing is this. The theory has 24 named tones, and 12 of them are fixed. They're the ones that Pythagoras said, but King Shogi in the 26th century or something gives us an example of the same thing, I think. That's my interpretation of it. Anyway, we start at, it could be, I guess that's the beginning of the 27th century BC. King Shogi wrote, I think in Sumerian, he was writing this text, we have the copy we have is cuneiform, it's Sumerian on one side and Akkadian on the other, and it's from, Bronze Age Mesopotamia. And he's describing what a great guy he is. Like, I'm such a great king, I can run from Ur to, Ashur, wherever it is, Ashur in 3 days. And I can lift so many cattle, and I can do all these things. And one of the many things that he's bragging about being able to do is to tune a lyre and to name the modes that are made thereby. So he's sort of describing how the process of doing that. And as far as I'm not a philologist. I don't speak Sumerian or Akkadian or read it. I depend on a body of literature from people who are studying this. But it seems to me like if when I've tried to do that experiment, it pretty much it comes out looking like a moment of symmetry of some sort, something that only has 2 sizes of interval, and that it seems to me that those intervals pretty much have to be what we now call Pythagorean. So it's made in circles of fifths. So they had base 60 math, and it was more difficult to do. Pythagoras has one of the reasons he's famous for doing this is because it was much easier for him to do it in base 10 math and to demonstrate it and have people just do it in their heads quickly. So 12 of the tones that are in use are 3 limit just intonation tones that we just call them Pythagorean. And then there's 12 other ones that are, I don't want to say variations of those, but they are different, others. And not only are they other, but they have a range. They're not necessarily fixed. They can be made to have a range of notes.
They're not in a chain.
You could set up an instrument like in a chain if you wanted to, and it would be acceptable, because the ones that are, here's the thing, as long as you have examples on your instrument that can properly evoke each kind of genus, then you can be correct. People can say, oh, that's not, you could say, I wouldn't play it that high, but I recognize the jints you're playing, so it's legit. So anywhere within that range is partly, well, it's partly up to the poet. It's partly up to the person playing or singing. And it's partly also regional. So in Turkey, I'm going to use something without frets just to kind of, but let's say that this is our fundamental. And here's our major third. It's the fifth partial.
I'm happy I can hear that through the call.
You can hear it?
Yeah, in fact, it's a lot clearer than when you were playing your electric guitar there.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's electric guitars have their own problems. So now I want to find that. I'm playing it as a 10th because we're hearing it. So now, if we're playing in a makam that uses this as the major third, if that's happening in Turkey, in Syria, they might want it just a tiny bit lower. So if this is 5 against, let's call it 5 against 4 because as a third, as a 10th is 5 against 2. So maybe this is so as a second from an open string, again it's in an oud-shaped theory. That's open is going to be 9 times against 10. So if I'm in Syria, which is just a little bit further east and south, I would want maybe 11 over 10 instead of 10 over 9.
Giving you an 11 over 9 third.
Yeah, the third it's 99 over 80, I guess, because you have to add a whole step. One. So from here to here is 9 against 8. 9 against 8 times 11 over 10 is 99 over 80. So,
yeah.
And then this, as a 10th, it's 99 over 40. Anyway, there's no need for everybody. Don't get frightened. Those of you, you don't have to know this at all. And then, the further you get to, around Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, by the time you get to Egypt, it's quite low. It's quite a bit lower. So, and that happens.
That's how that works.
That happens pretty much with all of the non-fixed, what do you call variable tones, so that we have ranges for all of them, and they get lower the further around the Fertile Crescent you go, around the Mediterranean you go. So depending on the repertoire you're playing, you would adjust those fixed ones, but the fixed ones are always the same. The Pythagorean ones are always going to remain the same. So, and it's pretty easy when you're tuned in fourths and fifths because that's where you're mostly getting them, or the ones that you'll need are going to be, you can check them against an open string. So once you develop an ear for fourths and fifths, it's pretty easy to get those guys over time.
I guess I didn't know that those regional differences were geographically based in a similar way that Western music was. Like, because I know that we learned that organs tuned in mean tone temperament in the Western tradition had differing pitch standards for a while, just because like things are farther away and technology is not as far along. So I guess these regional differences in makams sort of are kind of similar. It's like we've settled in this place, so this is how we do it, but things kind of change slowly over time and over the geography.
I think they didn't realize it until recordings. Recordings in the area I haven't heard of a recording before about 1904, but there was really, like, the theory got to be changing by like the 30s and 40s. There was really clear people are going like, oh no, we were clearly doing things differently. But I think everybody thought that they were doing it the same, called it, because the names of the notes are Persian names, so they're not C, G, D, A, B. No, they're not letter names. This is Rost, and that's Dugya, and this is Segya, Chagya. Like, they all have names,
right?
And the names don't necessarily repeat at the octave. This is Kaba Rost, and that's Rost, but that one's Gerdanier. It has a completely different name. So you have to memorize all the names. But because it's oud oriented, like this one, should be a D. And it's a Turkish instrument, and I use it to teach and play with Turks and people in that world. But this one same. Well, that's not an oud. That has 5 courses. But say this one, it's tuned just like it's tuned in the same configuration, but the Arabs play it a whole step lower. So this is C to C. So, but it doesn't matter because when you take the four upper courses, 1, 2, 3, 4, and make a minor third on that 4th string, that's called Rost. It doesn't matter if you tuned F to F or C to C or D to D or wherever you're tuning. Physically, the Makam, the place, is there. So you're playing in Rost no matter how the instrument is tuned. So
I see.
We're just saying, we're playing the same. They thought they were naming the same notes, saying, oh, what are the names? What are the notes in such and such a Makam? They would name them, and they say, oh, that's the same one we use. But then when they were hearing recordings of each other, by 1910 certainly, people were listening to each other's music or be like, what? That can't possibly be. So when I play, there's a bunch of makams that I play from a Turkish point of view. This has happened to me, I don't know how many times. And some Arab music enthusiasts will come up and say, yeah, but that's not really makam, you're playing in major. Or you're faking Western. I'm like, no, actually, this makam was invented by such a sultan, invented it in 15th, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then you give them examples and you say, see, it's just that people aren't listening to each other's music. That's another thing. And I have to say that this is a super lucky situation I just dropped into, is that my hometown has a university with a Middle East ensemble, again, run by ethnomusicologist Dr. Scott Marcus, where we're playing Egyptian music, we're playing Syrian music, we're playing Jordanian music, we're playing music from Armenia and Greek and Sephardic and Turkish, and normally you wouldn't, like, Persians aren't listening to Armenian music. The Armenians aren't listening to Lebanese music. Oh, the ones that are there are, but I mean, it's not. It's weird to have a band that's one band that's doing all of that. So I got lucky that the tutti frutti nature of my learning experience, led me to notice all of these. Not notice, but to be taught them, and notice after. Once someone points it out, now you'll hear it. Now you go, oh yeah, that third degree of is higher. I wonder where this is from.
Oh yeah, I saw a video where somebody, I think, was explaining that the Beyati second was lower in the Arabic regions than in the Turkish regions. Although perhaps I got it backwards. But yeah.
No, that's correct. That's right. But even so, then Beyati is really closely related to, say, Husseini.
Right.
And so in Turkey, it's like, oh, but if you're in Husseini, that second should be a little bit higher. Not as high as you play it in Rost, but not as low as you play it in,
I can see that those...
Actually, that's one of the hazards or issues with having frets on an instrument, or fixed pitches, whether it's a kanun or a tambour or a bowed tambour or anything, is that like originally these instruments, this is just an electric version of the nodalata, so the nodalata is over there, but it's harder to get at. But the idea is that there used to be more. There used to be 1 or 2 more in here and 1 or 2 more in here, and just playing, because it's not just to listen. If you're sitting in a really resonant space and you just dig your reverb or whatever, and you want to just hear intervals, oh, it's beautiful. But if you want to play at the speed of repertoire, your fingers, it'll be buzzing. You might as well either have, fewer frets, or I took some frets off of the nodalata. It just wasn't. I couldn't hit them accurately at the speed of repertoire. So then you're like, well, like here's an example exactly. This is a different instrument. I have to switch the channel here.
Oh yeah, I also wanted to ask you a question when you get back. Well, I was wondering, how do you find new repertoire to play in that Middle Eastern ensemble, or generally?
I mean, I'm drowning in it. I mean, firstly, I'm again, because I'm in this other ensemble. Basically, I can get it from other ethnomusicologists who are doing something in the region, I've just been in like 4 or 5 bands, and like I lived in Turkey for years, and I brought back stuff that nobody else had heard, and I gave it to them, and then some Armenian guy shows up, and we have like, it's not just this band, but there are several situations like this in the United States. There are maybe 5 universities where there's programs where you can actually kind of get involved with an ensemble like this. And then there are these camps, usually in the summer, where you could, you go for a week or 2 weeks and you just study with, again, usually there's one in, I'm not sure where it is. I think it's in Boston, where it's just Arab music, or there's some Turkish repertoire, but they do it in an Arab way. But there's a situation like up in Mendocino, where I've taught for the last 6 or 7 years, I guess, or maybe more. Every year, that's a week-long thing, or 10 days, something like this. So 2 weekends plus the week, and then and so there's somebody. Everyone brings together new repertoire, and you're like, wow, there's 7 tunes I never heard before. Here's another, So I don't know, like, I guess the answer is just to know somebody who's like, I'm just awash, and I have drawers full of printed music. And I did a lot of transcription. Like, I would have to do recordings and then write them out, So then any transcription is also a version, you know what I mean? There's not necessarily a definitive version. And actually an important thing to keep in mind is that it really is an oral tradition in the sense that everybody learns it's heterophonic. So what that means is everybody plays their own version of the melody, and so that your intonation can be slightly different, not in the fixed notes, but in the interpretable ones, with the people you're sitting right next to, and it's a little bit jangly this way, but it's supposed to sound like that. And then everybody ornaments the way they want to. In other words, nobody's reading off. At first, if you're learning it from a page, everybody's reading off the same page. But once you've learned the page, once you've learned it, you stop reading and you develop your own version. So that's kind of that's a unique feature. We don't do that in the West much. Yeah. So the tune itself, then you say like, well, what is the tune?
Right.
Everybody's got a different version, slightly. Oh, but I was just going to say that here's an instance where the idea of this instrument was it took some intervals that were described in not in Shulgi from 2600, but later in about, I want to say 1900 or maybe 1800 BCE. I think the city of Mari, which is now in Syria, and it was it's still Bronze Age, I guess, at that point, or getting towards the end of it. Yeah, no, Bronze Age, still in 19. And the idea is that it organizes the intervals given using the logic of Makam. So with these other instruments, what you do is you figure out what you need within a tetrachord, say, within a perfect fourth, to get every quality of genus that you're going to need. And then you repeat that at the major second and at the perfect fourth and at the perfect fifth, and you've got an octave's worth of stuff. So that's kind of the logic that's how you put it together. Again, it's the oud, or I guess oud shape that shapes the thinking of the theory. And so, but here's one where it kind of takes literally the idea that there's only 24 tones. Actually, there's not on this, but we were talking about where there's 12 Pythagorean ones and 12 non-Pythagorean ones. Then the idea is that basically you're saying, well, we have 2 kinds of every interval you're used to in Western music. So that's only literally true if you say, well, an octave and the unison and an octave are 2 different kinds of one thing, or you could say that those are exceptions. Or you could say that it's not, there's 2 kinds of tritone, but then there's only one kind of fourth and one fifth. Or you could say there's 2 kinds of fourths and a fifth, and there's no tritone. Anyway, that's just nitpicking a way to say it. But in other words, that there's a low minor second, then there's a high minor second, then there's a low major second, then there's a high major second, and then there's a low minor third and a high minor third, and then a low major third, a high one. So the idea there is because I'm taking that literally with these are Babylonian intervals. that I just got out of a book, somebody's interpretation who is a philologist and knew something about the music. So because of that, then I have to use, I don't have variations of my low major second. So if I want the low one, say I'm in Beyati and I'm playing Babylonian style, now that's pretty low. Maybe in Egypt they think it's right, or maybe I have to bend it a little, but it's higher than, it's not minor.
Right.
Like each of those is very distinct, but I'm sometimes having to use a high minor second as my low major second. I'm having to use one note for both functions. Whereas on these instruments, the Turkish-oriented ones, I just put that fret in there, and I'm still limited because if I want to play now Syrian music, I'm like, well, which one do I choose? Is there something in between the two? But you know what I mean? You just kind of.
Would you say, with fretted instruments, you're always going to run into a situation where you can't quite get all of the notes that you would want, and so really fretless is just the best way to do it?
Well, I mean, it's fun to work within, limitations anyway, and it's just kind of, again, it's like, I mean, it took years to get these dang things together, and a lot of, a lot of draining the money. I'm fortunate in that I've somehow managed to get the music making thing to make enough money to pay for the gear now. That took a long time to do. So I don't feel like I'm, just pouring money down the hole. But, I would say that in principle, you're right. But it's true that you just can, you could fake it. You could call it heterophonic and it's your style. You could play fretless. I have a fretless electric guitar somewhere too. It's out on loan somewhere, but I mean, there are multiple ways of getting around it, or just choosing. It's like, hey, look, I'm feeling Babylonian today, and you could deal with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This is great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your collection with us. This has been Dr. Eric Ederer. Thank you so much for being on the show. Where can we find your material?
Well, now I've got a bunch of stuff up at ericederer.com. ERICEDERER, and you can find links to, I'll send you a copy of my dissertation if you want it. I'm selling a book it's Makam and Beyond, a progressive approach to Near Eastern music theory. It's cheaper as a PDF. If you don't mind PDFs, just zap me an email. You can find that online at that website. It's just ericederer.com, whatever. You know how email works. I've got a YouTube channel where there's some weird stuff, some of it Makam oriented. What else? You can find me on Facebook. I don't yet do Instagram. I don't know. I'm at that age where it's like, Instagram is what? It's the place where I would show you photographs of how much I don't care about photographs of.
Right. That's how I feel about TikTok right now.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I don't have a TikTok account. You can't find me there. But I'm happy to usually respond to emails and questions about Makam stuff. Facebook, ericederer.com, and just look up my name on YouTube, and also a band. The bands I'm in are Makam Liberation Front. There's some videos on my YouTube channel, and I think there's stuff on SoundCloud with Flor de Canela is one band I'm in. It's Sephardic music, mostly from the Eastern Mediterranean. Kalinka, this is Balkan and klezmer and swing, and the Middle East Ensemble of the University of California, Santa Barbara. Those are the main bands I'm in right now. We're not doing any gigging. Very little.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we can't wait to get back to that, can we?
Yeah. Definitely. Fingers crossed until the downbeat. Yep. Thanks so much for having me, and it has been a great little time here.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you later. Bye-bye. Hey all, thanks for listening to this episode of Now and Zen, featuring Dr. Eric Ederer. Please check out his book, Makam and Beyond, A Progressive Approach to Near Eastern Music Theory, which describes a lot of what we were talking about today in greater detail. As some of you may know from previously listening to this podcast, it is going to take a hiatus, so this is the last episode for a while, and as the creator of the podcast, I will come back to making it if I get 60 patrons on my Patreon account. So for now, I'm shifting my focus elsewhere in terms of extra microtonal work. So I'm focusing on microtonal education, composition, and performance opportunities, and trying to sort of come up with things that people haven't done or that I think would be interesting or that would benefit everybody in the microtonal world. So that's what I'm doing over on my Patreon account. I think I might change the name to something like Microtonal Halberstadt Keyboards, but it's difficult to come up with a name that is specific to what I'm doing that's also general enough that somebody can understand what it is immediately. But regardless, I'll be posting lots of content there about behind-the-scenes looks at my videos and things like that. I'm also going to be continuing to post monthly content on my Patreon account, even if it's not related to Now and Zen, although I will try and make it relevant to general topics, such as something that would be talked about on a podcast or a topical video, so that it's not necessarily focused on what I'm doing as a composer or an educator, but on something else. Thanks everyone for listening, and we do have one more episode of Now and Zen in 2020. We do have Subrag Singh's bonus Patreon episode, so that is going to be coming out on the last day of December, so please check that out. And thank you all so much for listening. It's been great doing this podcast, and I hope to catch you again later. This episode would not be possible without the generous support of our Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods, Sheldon Bird, Tristan Nunez, Barry Lemon, Ari Cello, Rob Astor, Adam Fries, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Sicarella, Kit Duguay, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, and Tina Harmon-Carto. Thanks, everybody.